Great. Um, yeah, thank you so much for this invitation. I'm so excited to be here. Fell in love with native plants 20 years ago when I moved into my current place, and there was crabgrass and ivy and Himalayan blackberry, and I took it all out and just kind of started educating myself about native plants. And pretty early on, I found the California Native Plant Society, and it was a great resource for me as I was learning more about, first planting California natives, and then as I started to learn more, specifically planting San Francisco natives, and doing a lot of research into shade and water and all that, and then still finding there's some trial and error about who's actually going to be really happy in my little yard. But I just love my native plants so much, and I love seeing them when I'm out hiking. And anyway, I'm very happy to be here. Um, so let me tell you a little bit about Water Always Wins. And in this book, I traveled around the world and I documented what I call the slow water movement, and I'll tell you more about that. But this is 100% compatible with native plant love, because it's really about restoring ecosystems, and I'll tell you a lot more about that. But I'm gonna kind of like paint the big picture of what the slow water movement is, and how that can help us to stabilize flood and drought, dramatically reduce flood and drought impacts, stabilize the climate, and provide much, much more habitat for our native plants and critters. Um, we're seeing increasingly frequent droughts and floods and fires, and our standard approach to landscapes, to water, is to manage it, to control it. But those attempts are failing increasingly often. I'm gonna try to turn off this if I can, the transcript. It's a little bit in my way, but it's okay. Um, this woman in this picture is in Iraq. She's on the Mesopotamian marshes of Iraq, which are one of the cradles of civilization. And she's part of a culture called Madan, which means marsh dwellers. And these folks have continued this way of life atop the Mesopotamian marshes for 9,000 years, which is just kind of hard to even conceive of. Um, and so, in the dominant culture here, we always think about controlling water, and getting it, for what we want, too much, too little. But the Madan have a very different way of relating to water. They exist with it. They see it as the source of all life. And I can't help but think that there's something to teach us there. They build everything out of Phragmites australis, which you might be familiar with because it's super invasive here in North America, but it's native to the Mesopotamian marshes. It grows like 20 feet tall, and they build islands out of it that they then live on top of. They build their homes and their animal paddocks, and they build this, which is called a mudif, and it's a cultural building where they have all their main cultural events. And during their 9,000 years, so many civilizations have risen and fallen around them, many of them irrigated agriculture. But when those civilizations would fall, the waters would retake the marshes, and the Madan would just continue their way of life. And now it's threatened by upstream dams from Turkey and Iran that are preventing water from going down into the marshes, but they are persevering. These pictures are both taken near Sacramento. The one on the left was 2017, which was like a big atmospheric river year. The one on the right was 2015, which was a big drought year. And, climate change is definitely altering the water cycle and playing a role in these bigger floods and droughts. And increasingly, attribution science is showing us that. But something is missing from this narrative, and this is what I'm hoping to communicate to you. Land and biology play a big role in stabilizing the climate. Water is a greenhouse gas, water vapor, and it's also the key way that the planet cools itself. And this is a critical fact that is widely ignored. And in fact, we usually respond to flood and droughts by calling for more control. You know, we often hear, oh, our infrastructure wasn't built for these extremes, but our infrastructure is part of the problem. People call for higher levees, bigger dams, longer aqueducts, but we have altered 75% of land on Earth with industrial agriculture, industrial forestry, urban sprawl, and the way that we control rivers, cut them off from their floodplains, drain wetlands. And so in those ways, um, we've broken the water cycle, and it is actually amplifying the effects of the carbon emissions. So we could get off fossil fuels tomorrow and we would not solve climate change because we're not paying attention to the water cycle piece of it. So a lot of this comes down to culture. And in the book, I really talk about the need to change the culture of how we relate to water, right? We, in the dominant culture, it's all about us. What can water do for us? But putting ourselves first in that way isn't working. You know, if we're worried about flooding, we build a levee. If we need more water, we bring it in from elsewhere. But these single focus solutions ignore water's relationship with geology and microbes and plants and beavers and people. And so when we're ignoring them, we're damaging them. And that's why it's a big part of why we're experiencing increasing flood and drought and fire. It's the way that we've desiccated the landscape and interfered with the water cycle. So here are a few statistics to just give you a sense of what I say when we've altered the water cycle. Humans have filled or drained as much as 87% of the world's wetlands. We've dammed and diverted 2/3 of the world's big rivers. The area just since 1992, where we've encroached floodplains, cut rivers off from their floodplains and built stuff on them, is the size of Ukraine, which is a very big country. Deforestation is decreasing rainfall locally, regionally, and globally. And in general, a lot of the extreme drought that we're seeing in the West is because we've desiccated the land by killing beavers, levying rivers, overgrazing, and overpumping of groundwater. So the people I met in my book, this is actually a hopeful book because I met people who are working on solutions, and these are engineers, ecologists, landscape architects, indigenous peoples, urban planners, farmers, ranchers, foresters, and they're asking a really different question, which is not what do we want, but what does water want? And what I've come to understand is what water really wants is a return of its slow phases that are particularly prone to our disruption. So this is return of floodplains, wetlands, mountain meadows, and forests. And these slow phases, they absorb floods, they provide water in the dry season, they keep temperatures and rivers more even for fish, they clean water, and they support many, many forms of life that help to keep these systems stable. So the slow water movement, I coined that thinking of the slow food movement, and there are some commonalities, and it is a global movement. It goes by different names in different places, but they all have to do with restoring these natural slow phases of water ecosystems. They respect water's agency and relationships. They deploy systems thinking instead of that single focus thinking that I was describing. You know, now we tend to have centralized water management, but these projects are local and they're distributed across the landscape. And if you think of that 87% of wetlands that we've taken away from water, you begin to understand why we need lots of small projects all along water's path that give water space to slow again and move underground. And the good news about that is that it's scalable. You know, it's something that we can do in our own areas with our neighbors, and every little bit helps. It's a cumulative impact. Slow water projects are socially just. They don't give to one community and take from another. So I think people understand levees as an environmental justice issue because if you're protecting one community with a levee, you're cutting the river off from its floodplain. And so the water level in the river is increasing, and that increases flood risk for this other community over here who maybe can't afford a levee. But dams are also environmental justice issues. A survey looked at 40 years of dams around the world and found that they brought water to 20% of the world's population, and they decreased water availability to 24% of the world's population. Um, so slow water projects that are local are making the most of the water that comes to a local area. And they engage the community in care for the water. And that can look a lot of different ways. So some of the countries I went to, like Peru or India, local people were coming together as a community and actively restoring places and maintaining these slow water systems. And in some places like the United States, maybe the experts are still involved, but a floodplain is turned into a park, and maybe there's educational signage that explains to people what the land and water are doing in this area. Um, I just want to briefly show you this graphic because it represents something very important about water that I think people in California really didn't understand for a long time. We have this big history of pumping groundwater, and there was this idea that groundwater is extra water. You often hear people talk about, oh, it's a bank. So, when you have a drought year, you can pump groundwater. But as this graphic shows, surface water and groundwater are the same water. They are connected. And so when you pump out groundwater, surface water goes down to fill it. So you're actually decreasing your surface water by pumping groundwater. And similarly, if you can recharge groundwater, you're helping the surface water to be more consistent. Here in the West, so many of our streams only run for, a month or two in winter, and we think that's normal. That is not normal. Historically, a lot of these streams ran year round because they were supplied with a healthy groundwater table. Um, so I know people think we don't have enough water, but that's not true. We do. We have an allocation problem where very rich people get a giant share of the water. But also, when we take care of the landscapes, we actually enable there to be more water for everyone. And I can talk a little bit about that later. Another thing about having a healthy groundwater table is it decreases fire risk because the plants, even in drought, can tap into that water and they're less dried out and less able to burn. So most slow water projects start with something called historical ecology, and this is a picture of South Seattle in the mid 1800s and today. And you can see that the Duwamish River was, had lots of curves and meanders, and all of that kind of greenish and brownish area around were available to the river to move onto these floodplains and the delta. And now you can see it's like very constricted and there's stuff built like right along to the edges and straightened. And this is a very common pattern. But the reason it's important to start with historical ecology is because water has a memory. Water wants to go where it wants to go, and often where it wants to go is where it once went historically before we tried to subvert it. So this is why you'll often see flooding happening in places where there were wetlands that were built on top of, or where there's a creek stuffed in a pipe just underground. The water is still trying to make its way there. And so I think, when we have cities, we think, oh, everything's built, nothing changes. But in fact, cities do change a lot over time. And if a city can prioritize returning space to water in these key places where water wants to be anyway, you can have a really outsized reduction of flood risk, which I could talk about later if we have time. Um, so yeah, and I'll just add there's an interesting field called sociohydrology, which is the intersection of people and water. And there's something called the levee effect. So you've probably seen this, like, somebody builds a levee in a place that was flooding, and everyone's like, great, now there's a wall. So we have all this new real estate where we can build stuff. But water people have a joke that there are two kinds of levees, ones that have failed and ones that are going to fail. And so you might reduce the frequency of flooding by putting that levee there, but sooner or later you're just gonna have a bunch more stuff to be devastated when it floods. And reservoirs also provide that false sense of security. And I think, we see that all over California, right? We've brought water from elsewhere, which has allowed the population to, like, look at Los Angeles. There's so many more people living there than they have enough water for. And agriculture, we've expanded our agriculture way beyond what we can comfortably um, support, which is why when we have drought years, we have people digging up their trees and whatnot. So it also provides that false sense of security, and it makes us reliant upon water that isn't natural to the area. It makes just more people vulnerable to that drought cycle. Um, so this was my own historical ecology research. This picture on the left is a view from above of my little garden. You can see ceanothus, of course. Back in this corner is a buckeye, which had just leafed out. This thing in the middle is a red twig dogwood. The grasses aren't looking very happy, but I have various bunch grasses around that little patio area. I do have, oh, this one I think is red elderberry. I've got lots of stuff. I've got a polypody under there. I've got hummingbird sage up here, yarrow. I've got all kinds of great stuff. And it just brings me so much joy. This picture on the right is taken in Vancouver, and it's a bioswale. And this is a way that people are making cities more permeable to absorb more flood, more rains when it comes. Because part of the reason we have flooding is because everything's paved. And so the water can't soak in. It all runs off at once into a straightened river channel, which is like a fire hose. And then you get, more erosion and more fast water. Um, so the important thing about the bioswales is it's great if you have native plants that can tolerate, dry and wet periods. And it's very important that your bioswale not have big parking curbs all around them. I've seen them built some places, and it's like, how is the water going to get in there? I mean, the rain can fall directly on it, but you want water that's rushing off the street to be able to get in there too. So that's an important thing to think about. And I know I don't have to convince this audience of the importance of native plants, but if you're trying to convince other people to get rid of their lawns, lawns are the largest irrigated crop in North America. They're an ecological desert. They require fertilizers and pesticides that then run off and pollute the water. And they use 9 billion gallons of water every day just in the United States. So a place that has really taken this making cities more permeable to a larger scale is China. And they call it sponge cities in China, which is very evocative. And, there's been a massive movement from the countryside to cities, and they've seen really, really fast urbanization over the last few decades. And so there's been this massive rise in urban flooding as well, and people have died and continue to die in these floods, and it causes tons of damage. And so there's a landscape architect there named Yu Kongxiong, and he founded a landscape architecture firm called Turinscape, and they do projects like this. So you can see that this area is a park and people can enjoy it when it's dry. And he always has these like walkways through his projects so that people can engage with it even when it's wet or muddy. And here is, look at the sides of the river too, where you also have some greenery. And here it is in flood. So all of this was designed to help absorb this water. This area, the trees along the river sides also help to protect and to clean the water. Um, so they're doing this in more than 500 cities now. And the goal is to make, I think they were like 10 or 20% permeable in a city, and their goal is to make it 70 or 80% permeable by 2030. But the project areas are maybe like 5 square miles. And so if you have a city that's 1,000 square miles, you're still going to probably have flooding. So even though China is really ambitious in this, it's still early days. But the good news is that this is becoming more and more widely understood and deployed around the world. San Francisco is doing it a bit. Philadelphia is really a leader in the US. Detroit is doing a good bit of it. So those are some examples you can look at closer to home. Because we live in San Francisco, I'll talk a little bit about coastal issues, which can also be protected by restoring native habitat. So California has seen 6 inches of sea level rise over the last century, which is a bit slower than on the East Coast and the Gulf Coast, but it's expected to ramp up toward the middle of the century. We already see king tide flooding, like along the Embarcadero and in San Rafael. Um, and it could rise as much as 7 feet by 2100. And I think, if you walk down at Chrissy Field, they have a really cool pole that shows you what that might look like. So you have a sense of everything that might be underwater. And I think that kind of public, infrastructure is helpful to help people understand. Um, Sea levels are not just rising because the ice is melting. And they're not just rising because, water expands when it warms and seas are warming. They're also rising because of the way we're treating water on land, because of the way we're rushing water off the land and pumping out groundwater. We're doing it so much that we're actually significantly contributing to sea level rise. As much as 40% of sea level rise can be from that mismanagement of water on land. Um, so you may have heard about the salt pond restoration projects that have been going on for about 20 years around the bay. And this picture shows the historic tidal marshes before we started filling them in and building on top of them. And at the apex of damaging them, we had destroyed about 90%. Over the last few decades, as people have started to restore them, we now have about 28% of the historic wetlands and another 12%, like they've already bought the land and they're starting to work on it. Their goal is to restore 50% by 2030, I think, because time really is of the essence. And a really amazing thing about tidal marshes is they can actually keep up with sea level rise if they have enough time, space, and sediment. And for a long time, we had enough sediment in the bay because of the legacy of hydraulic gold mining, which was terrible for rivers, as you probably know. But, people just took these massive hoses and were trying to degrade the riverbanks so that all that sediment would come into the river and they could get more gold from it. And they call it like a pulse, and it was just coming out into the bay for more than 100 years. But now that's done. And now we have sediment scarcity in the bay. And part of the reason is when everybody was filling the bay to build more stuff, you may know about the Save the Bay movement, which happened in the 1960s. Um, Dumping sediment in the bay can harm the animals that live on the mud flats, and a lot of it was polluted, and they were introducing contaminants. And so as a result, there became this practice of just dumping that sediment out in the ocean. And so more recently, people have realized, oh, we actually need that. That's a very important ingredient for the tidal marshes for the plants there. And so they're changing various policies and checking to make sure it's clean and working on scientific projects to see like how can we release the sediment in a way where it distributes fairly naturally and has as little impact on the ocean critters as possible. And I can tell you more about that if you want. But I really love this picture. This is from near Corte Madera up in Marin. And This is what's called in not antique marsh, archaic marsh. It's like 13,000 years old. You know, it's from the last ice age. And look at all the different colors of green. And that is because there are tiny little differences of elevation in the marsh, which allows all these different plants to grow. And then, you know, different birds nest or eat on the different plants. And so you can just see like how incredibly diverse it is. And it's also very important there, it's connected, right? The marsh is connected both upstream and out into the deeper water of the bay. There's the subtidal ecosystem with eelgrass and oysters, the mudflats with egrets and endangered least terns hunt, the low marsh with Pacific cordgrass, the marsh plain, which has pickleweed, the high marsh with gum plant, and then the transition zone that reaches into the uplands. And you can see the oaks in the foreground of this picture. And when you don't have human-made barriers like dams or development, these zones exchange critical sediment and nutrients, and the water moves those along, and that keeps them all functioning. And they're also better for protecting people because these tiny little differences in elevation in the marsh actually help it to absorb wave energy better than even the restored marshes, which have kind of a long way to go. Here you can see a a salt pond on the right, and then on the left is a very newly restored marsh, and you can see like it's quite flat and there isn't a lot of color variation, and that's because it hasn't really had time to develop that extreme biodiversity that we saw in the marsh that was 13,000 years old. So, you know, hopefully it won't take that long for this one to become a lot better looking and serving, but that's where we're at right now. I'll just add that wetlands are super stores of carbon dioxide as well. They can store 3 to 5 times more than forests. And they can actually increase their rate of carbon storage with sea level rise if they don't drown too quickly. So it's really important that we take care of them while we can. It's very, very important that we don't build more along the coast, which some places are still trying to do, like Redwood City and Newark, because the more space we take away, the more we're increasing wave energy and height in other areas. So we need to give the bay as much space as we can to naturally build itself up and protect us from those floods. Here we have our friend the beaver. Beavers have become kind of popular in recent years thanks to a few books, and my book has a chapter on beavers, and I'm specifically looking at the way beavers are being deployed to help with both flood and drought. So you may know the story of beavers. When settlers came, there's a big hat industry that used beaver fur, and so most of them were killed, and it dramatically altered the plumbing of North America and Europe because beavers are incredible water engineers. 1/10 of North America was beaver created wetlands before they were all killed. And so the continent that we know, especially the West, is much, much drier than it was historically. And beavers are thought to create floods. That's one of the reasons why they're sometimes considered a nuisance, but in fact, they can actually prevent floods. So they were completely eliminated from Europe, sorry, from England, from the UK 400 years ago, and they lived without beavers for 400 years. And now they're starting to bring them back from Europe because they want them to protect against flooding, because a beaver dam slows water. So it's a little bit porous. The water is still going to go through, but over a longer period of time. You know, I showed you that straight and stream in Seattle. That's fast water, and that increases flood risk. But if you can slow the water, and it's going over a longer period of time, you're going to have a lower flood peak. And so many like really old English villages are built close to the river, and they're flooding more and more with climate change. And so reintroducing beavers helps to slow water and helps reduce that flooding. Even in saturated midwinter conditions. Sometimes you hear, oh, like there's too much rain, the soil is saturated. That's often a sign that the soil isn't healthy, that the microorganisms that live in the soil are dead because of mismanagement, because healthy organic soil can hold orders of magnitude more water than damaged soil. I really love this poster. California did actually parachute beavers into the backcountry in the 1920s, sorry, the 1950s. It started earlier in Idaho. And it was because 100 years ago, people were realizing beavers help create healthy streams and healthy areas for fish. And, we can repair our streams by getting beavers back into these headlands, where they're going to create great habitat. And so it was interesting because there was this, beavers have had this push and pull with settler culture where people are like, grab them for the money, for the fur, then, oh no, we need more beavers. Then, oh no, they're nuisances, they're causing flooding, kill them all. Oh no, we need them back. So hopefully this current phase where we're welcoming them back will persist. And it really started in the modern era in the 1990s in Washington state, and now it's spread to all the Western states, including like super red states like Wyoming. And a lot of it has started with ranchers and farmers because they've noticed that when they don't kill them and they allow them to build their dams, they have a higher water table and they don't have to irrigate their crops as much. They don't have to bring in hay for their animals as much. And then they have success and their neighbors follow that success. And finally, California got on board in just in 2022. And so beavers have incredible water storage capabilities. One study in Washington found that in the first year beavers were reintroduced to an area, their ponds stored 75 times more water above and below ground per 100 meters of stream than areas without. So particularly, we've long relied on the snowpack, and the snowpack is melting with climate change. Letting beavers come back and do their thing is another way to keep water available to us throughout the dry season. And another researcher has found that they're really helpful in creating fire breaks. Obviously, water doesn't burn, but also because they're raising the water, that groundwater table across a wider area, it's not just the pond, but the plants near the pond are much wetter. They have much more access to water. And so that typically beavers would build, they have their kits, the kits move down the stream. And so there'd be like a whole series of dams, which can help regenerate a wide area. Here is a beaver dam up near Lassen Volcanic National Park. The dam is this thing in the front, and this pond behind was created by the beavers. And these big bushes along the way are willows, which are, a classic riparian plant. And so, yeah, California, sorry, I started to say that. In 2022, they created 5 full-time positions at Fish and Wildlife to help beavers come back because California is interested in them for their drought mitigation, their fire breaks, and also their help with biodiversity. And because, like 200 different species live in and around beaver ponds. They're really, really incredible. So, the LA fires are happening right now. And I think they're on a lot of people's mind. My family has a long connection with Lassen Volcanic National Park, which is where this picture is taken. There was the park fire this last summer, which, came very, very close for months. And 3 years ago, there's a Dixie fire. We're seeing this so much. And climate change is definitely playing a role, but this really dramatic way in which we've desiccated the landscape has contributed significantly. And industrial forestry has a lot to do with that. And even when foresters replant trees, it's often like a plantation of single species or two or three commercial species, they can often put pesticides on deciduous trees that are like not for market. And just, the more we learn about the mycorrhizal networks under forests and how trees are a community and they share resources with each other, they share water with each other. Um, you know, when you clear cut, you damage all of that. And just planting new trees there isn't going to reintroduce the same amount of moisture. You've killed all the critters in the soil by totally drying them out. Sometimes things are burned. Anyway, this picture I think is interesting. This was 2 years after the Dixie Fire, and this is in Lassen Volcanic National Park, and 60% of it burned. And look at this, like in the background, you can see trees that burned, but not all the trees burned. Some of them lived. And there were, and then this area, there's like a sea pier, and you have this incredible profusion of understory plants and ferns and whatnot. And it was just buzzing with insects and birds, and it was really incredible. And then just outside the park, there's Forest Service land and industrial forestry land, like outside of Chester, California, if you know where that is. And even like 3 and 4 years on, it is just a devastated hellscape. Like nothing is growing there. And it's because, that forest that was not actually forest, it was like a tree farm, did not have the resilience of the national park. So that's something to keep in mind. We've really had this extractive resource mentality for our forest lands, but the forests are also a very critical slow water zone. And, we do need wood, we need resources, but there are ways to get that aren't just maximizing profits and that are making space for these kinds of systems to thrive and, to reduce forest fire risk and to make more stuff available for all of us. There's also this narrative that like, our forests are decadent, right? Because we suppressed fires for 100 years and there's too much fuel and we have fuel loading and we need to rake the forests. But actually a study of 1,500 fires in the Western US over 30 years found that protected forest lands actually had lower fire severity than areas with more logging. And it's because, old trees transpire water, they create rain. And the understory plants, the decomposing wood, all of that creates the spongy, moist environment. And the mycorrhizal networks are part of that. And there's so many practices in industrial forestry that just destroy all of that. So healthy, intact ecosystems actually help to balance not just water, but also climate. And that's a whole other thing that I think I'm going to write another book about. But I do want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A. So I won't go too much into the science of that right now. Yeah, here is my book. The one with the fish is the North American version. There's the Chinese and then the UK editions. And I'll just say that, sooner or later, water does always win. And in the face of climate change and ecosystem collapse, biodiversity collapse, water scarcity, we really have to shift our relationship with water from a mindset of control to an idea of collaboration instead. Because taking care of natural systems, they actually take care of us. And this is something that many, many indigenous peoples long understood and still do. And it's something that we have forgotten in the dominant culture. But the extent now to which we've damaged these systems, we're hitting tipping points and we have to change. But there is a hopeful note to all of this that I met, in Peru, Kenya, India, all the places where I researched and wrote about in this book. Slow water projects are local. They are something that people can come together with their neighbors in their own community, in their own yards, and do small things and make space for water. And then cumulatively, it adds up to a big impact. So in the very local realm, it can make your community more resilient to flood and drought. And then cumulatively, it can have an impact, even locally, like on cooling temperatures and fire protection. So yeah, I think it's empowering to realize that taking care of landscapes in our own area can really make a big difference. And if you want more information, this is my website where I talk more about slow water issues, and it's got links to some of my other interviews and whatnot. So I could go on, but I want to leave time for questions. So I think I will stop.
Wow, that is wonderful. And it's so helpful and so hopeful. Thank you so much for writing this book. And I have it. It's great. I want that next book so badly. So take time for questions and immediately on to that next book because you're talking to the choir here. We want to have a better idea of how to help better manage that land. And so we really do have a bunch of people who advocate with the city. And right now, SFPUC, for some of their issues, is really doing a great job at trying to restore their reservoir, their lands. Lisa Wayne, who used to be with the San Francisco Rec and Park Natural Resources Division, is now running all of the land management for those. And so they're taking out eucalyptus from the reservoirs and they're revegetating them with local native plants.
Yeah, I've been seeing some of that.
Yeah, they've got a nursery in Sunol growing native plants with the local genetics. It's very exciting. So, uh, can you? I'm going to ignore Bob's question for just a minute. Can you talk with us about, I mean, you live here, local projects that you think you've seen or that you'd love to see, because you've really investigated where we've got opportunities here more than the rest of us might have seen.
Yeah, gosh. I mean, when I started restoring my yard to native plants, it was a super fringe thing. And, like I was buying, Bay Nature was operating out of that lady's estate. And, like she didn't want people to go up there. So, I would contact Paul and we'd like meet on the street and like open the trunks of our cars. And it was like we were doing a plant drug deal. So it's really exciting to see how much it's grown. Yeah, like all of the like I just see more and more native plants. Like the Presidio really started it, but now, Golden Gate Park is doing tons of it. And like just it seems like it's much more the default. And for years I felt like I was advocating for it. And, I'd talk to the city about, it was like, oh, those, they're all the reasons. So I'm just excited to see that it's really becoming much more popular. And I think, there's a real pride of place in native plants. Like, I try to emphasize that when I go to places where they're like, our lawn, we can't get rid of our lawn. But, like you live in a place ideally because you love it. And why do you love it? Like part of why you love it is because of its special plants that don't exist elsewhere. And so, why wouldn't you want that in your own area? In terms of like bigger projects, one I didn't talk about in this talk, but I do write about in my book is something called paleo valleys. And so I think people are probably familiar with how dramatically California has overpumped many of its aquifers and how groundwater levels are just dropping really dramatically and all of the problems associated with that. And with the snowpack melting, we don't have that as a reservoir. And, dams are hugely problematic, which I go into in some detail in my book. And, we've already dammed most of the rivers in California, so that's not really an option anyway. And so there's a hydrogeologist who is retired now, but he was at UC Davis named Graham Fogg. And he spent his career looking at these things called paleo valleys, which are super cool. They're the ancestors of today's rivers that came down off of the Sierra and into the Central Valley. And like every major river basically has a paleo valley underneath, and they're pretty close to the surface. So, there were several ages of glaciation which caused the paleo valleys, because, they would dig the river channel, the river would dig its channel, and then later in the glacial period, it would backfill with big rocks. And so they're super permeable. And a lot of the valley is clay. And so when you have like these big rocks, obviously, if you can put the water over that, it'll infiltrate really quickly and help to refill the groundwater table. And so he was like, we should be using these for recharge. And especially like when we have big rains and people are worried about downstream flooding. But nobody knew where they were. And anyway, DWR listened to him, and they started doing these surveys to map where they are. And so, like with the Groundwater Sustainability Management Act, Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, uh, a local area, if they have one of these paleo valleys, they could choose to make that, set aside for recharge. So that's a pretty cool thing. I did see someone say, like, where are we going to get energy if we don't have dams? So maybe I could address that quickly. Um, so a lot of dams don't provide too much energy. Like especially in California, they're much more for water storage rather than energy. Uh, Solar and wind are really, really taking off. They're so cheap. We have a lot of my partner writes all about energy. So believe me when I say that it is totally possible to get by on solar and wind and batteries and better transmission infrastructure that shares power across wider areas. A lot of that is already happening. A lot of that has happened. And we definitely don't need new dams. A lot of older dams are reaching the end of their lifespans, which means they are potentially really big flood risks. And I think too, like there was this idea that dams are baseload power, because the water flows all the time. But in a lot of places, they're becoming more unreliable. And it's because of climate change and mismanagement of water. So I think of places like Zambia or Mozambique, where they get almost 100% of their energy from one or two big dams. And, when they have a big drought, like their economy totally collapses because they have no power for months at a time. And so I just want to raise that like dams are not the stable source of energy that people have long presumed them to be. And there was also this long narrative that dams were carbon neutral because they're not burning anything. But in fact, concrete is one of the most carbon intensive products out there. And then there's also a lot of methane from the plants decomposing in the reservoir. And so, it can take a dam like 10 to 12 years of operation to work off that carbon debt before it's actually carbon neutral. And, there's just a million environmental reasons for why dams are bad. They've devastated aquatic life, including aquatic plants. The largest category of biodiversity decline is in freshwater systems. It's like 81% of species are really, 81% are really dramatically reduced. And so much of that has to do with dams. So yeah, I could rant all day about dams, but it's probably enough.
That is very helpful.
Ooh, I just read this comment about a board game about underground mushroom networks called Undergrove. That sounds really, really cool. Oh my
It
gosh.
from the person who did, oh God, I'm sorry, the way my thing works doesn't. It's the same woman, Elizabeth Hargrove, who did Wingspan.
Oh, wow.
Oh,
That's so
oh,
cool. I'm
it
gonna
just
have to get that.
I got that for Christmas, so it's great.
Awesome. All
And
right,
it's a
thanks.
little easier than Wingspan. So Wingspan is easier if someone teaches you how to play it because it's just hard. But it's a little bit easier, and they've got a better quick start guide. And so she's she's learned from that, and so it's really fun. So can't say enough about it.
That's great. All right. Somebody is referring to the Klamath Dam removal. And yeah, that is an amazing story. It's one that I followed for many years, and I visited the site when they had taken out one of the dams and they were getting ready to take out the second dam. So it was about a year ago. And it's really incredible. Another really incredible piece is like the tribes up there were very involved in the advocacy to make this happen. And the Yurok tribe has a really incredible stream restoration industry. They do the actual work with, the big cats and stuff, the what do you call it, bulldozers. But they also have a team of 50 scientists who are helping to do that work and on their own territory and also in other places and watersheds around Northern California. So yeah, they're just doing such cool work there.
I did not know they had a business doing stream restoration. That's great. We have so many covered streams in San Francisco, it drives me nuts.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. And I think, some of the big floods that have happened in New York City in the last few years have been interesting because, the places where you see like water pouring down subway stairs and like streets that are bogged down, those were wetlands and those were streams. Like they're literally right there. Someone was asking about how to manage water in a changing climate. So, if I could go back to sharing just really quick, let's see. I want to show you just briefly this project. So, um, in southern Arizona, they had a history of cutting all the trees and then, super, super intensive cattle grazing. They just grazed everything to the nub. So now they have these monsoons and the water, you have these dry washes most of the time. And then when it rains, the water will gush through and erode everything for like 2 or 3 hours and then it's gone. And so this graphic shows what people are starting to do. They started in southern Arizona, northern Mexico, and in fact, some of these are indigenous techniques that like the Hopi used for millennia to farm in their very dry area. But now more ranchers and stuff are doing it, and it's very, we have this scarcity mindset, right? When this one woman, Valor Clark, started doing it on her land, um, her downstream neighbors were like, they're taking our water, you know? If they're holding on to the water, we don't have the water. And a scientist who has spent some time researching their project and other ones and kind of like spreading the word through her science, found that this is what their area looked like. It was a dry wash, and after just a couple of monsoon seasons, it turned into a year-round wetland, and all the plants came back. They have like bears that come and like roll around in the water. It's incredible. And what the scientist Laura Norman found was that she did a parallel study with this restored watershed and a neighboring one that was still just all barren. And this creek actually produces 28% more water. And so by taking care of the creek, they've created more water for everyone. And it's because the water is like when it just rushes by, it's maybe evaporating off of the rocks. Here it's moving down into the underground and it's continuing to come up and feed the stream throughout the year. So you're putting it underground where it can't evaporate, and that's what leads to creating more water. And I like this story because it's a really good example of, we think that these desiccated areas are just hopeless, like, oh, we have a 20-year drought in the Southwest, there's nothing we can do. But people just aren't talking about landscape restoration. And when you create this, you create a cooler area locally. You start to regenerate the small water cycle, which is, a lot of rain comes not from evaporation over oceans, but transpiration from plants. Some places over the continent, 70% of rain comes from plant transpiration. It's not as much in California because we're so close to the ocean. But when the plant transpires, then it's going to rain again close by. The plants also release these tiny little fungi and spores and whatnot that help the rain to nucleate, that help that water vapor to turn into rain. And so then you restart a rain cycle. So, there was that old saw of like rain follows the plow. In fact, drought follows the plow and rain follows restoration. So that's what I would suggest for help with climate change. There's a lot more on that subject. It's really, really fascinating.
We want to know as much as you know. It's this is what we care about. And helping us, um, giving us the science, giving us examples that we can use with the city.
Hmm.
They help. We have some city agencies that are, let's just say, better than others about planting native plants and planting them in their plant communities so that we can store that water. And it would be great to restore some of these streams and do more with bioswales
Hmm.
and help us advocate for that.
Yeah. And, I think the guy in China, Kong Xiang, he calls it ecological security patterns. It's basically his name for historical ecology. But one thing I like about his term is that it really emphasizes that you are protecting human communities by making space for water. You're identifying the places where water wants to be, and by giving it back to water, you're reducing flood risk and you're reducing drought risk. And so I think if you frame it that way, there's more of an incentive for the city to like, okay, maybe if that building floods, maybe we're not going to rebuild another building right in that same place. Maybe it does make sense to return it to water. So, cities have 50-year plans, 100-year plans, and that kind of thing, I think, can be really helpful.
That's ecological security patterns. That's a wonderful phrase. Thank you. That's the city's gonna start hearing that in public. What other questions do we have? Oh yeah. I mean, we do have aquifers here in San Francisco that we are um, treating with varying levels of respect. I don't know if you're familiar with the ones under.
Yeah, I was talking to somebody at PUC a couple of years ago, and her name is escaping me at the moment, but she was telling me about the groundwater recharge that they're doing like out in the avenues and using those aquifers to supply, I think, like 8% of the city's water locally. Um, so that's interesting. One thing I write about in my book is that San Francisco historically was incredibly water poor, actually. There were a few creeks, but not many. And there's this fantastic book at the Bancroft Library Reading Room that, you can check out as a resource. I mean, you can't check it out. You have to look at it there. But this guy came to San Francisco in 1843, so before the gold rush. And he writes about like they had to go to Sausalito for water because there wasn't enough surface water available. And Sausalito, I think it means poplar, like little poplars, or it's a plant that grows along streams. So that's interesting.
Yeah, it's funny. The name Walnut Creek, they're not kidding. They creeks and Walnut Creek there. In fact, I think that we had right before the pandemic, we had a great talk that was not um, recorded. Unfortunately, we've only been recording since the pandemic by a guy who was a walnut expert. He's like, yeah, some of the best because walnuts are wind pollinated. And so they brought in black walnuts from the East Coast and they brought us in English walnuts, hoping to get like bigger, tastier walnuts and even taller trees. And so there's a lot of genetic sharing with our local walnuts. But he said there's a little patch in Walnut Creek somewhere that's got the closest to pure Northern California walnut genetics.
Oh, how neat. I see that someone just wrote, Bear writes about the historic fens between the dunes, particularly in Soma. I don't know Bear or his or her book. Could the person who posted that
Yeah, Bob, if
give
you
that
could
information?
the whole name and the name of the book, that would be amazing. Oh, and Bob is also talking about how the city is daylighting a portion of Yosemite Creek in McLaren Park. That was a Lisa Wayne project when she was with the Recon Park Natural Resources Area,
Mhm.
where she went to PUC. And that is amazing to walk that now because they restored it with native plants.
Oh,
And
cool.
that and how it's thriving and the insect and the birds, and then just not very far away to see some very unhappy unirrigated eucalyptus
Mm.
with no life in it is kind of hilarious slash sad.
Yeah, I remember when that project was going to happen, so I haven't seen it. I look for Peter Bay, the naturalist bear. Okay.
Oh, Bob, is that on our speaker series? Is that, I'm sorry, I must have missed that presentation. Okay, great. So that's on the CNPS YouTube channel. So we'd be able to see that. Thank you.
Okay.
Looks amazing.
Cool. I suspect you guys probably know Seep City and Joel
Yes,
Pomerantz. Yeah.
I've been on some of his walks. It's amazing. It's
Yeah.
great to see the way he sees the landscape.
Yeah, and like I write about him in my book as well. And the research that he's done into water in San Francisco is just really valuable. It's great.
Yeah, Alexander talks about how your book explores innovative approaches to managing water in a changing climate, and he's asking if you could highlight one or two examples.
Well,
Or,
I was responding to his question when I
oh,
talked
I see.
about the natural infrastructure for dryland streams. I could probably think of another example, but definitely restoring forests. There's another cool thing about forests that is emerging science, which is it's this idea of the biotic pump. So forests don't just grow where it rains, but they actively pull in the water that they need. And it's because when they transpire and the vapor is going up into the higher atmosphere, when the vapor changes from gas to liquid into rain, it creates a partial vacuum and that pulls in more wind. So, this is controversial for like 200 plus years. Wind is caused by temperature differentials. And she's saying it's also this phase change. She's an atmospheric physicist. She's saying it's the phase change. Sorry, the person is Anastasia Makariba. She's the one who came up with this biotic pump theory, as well as a deceased colleague. But anyway, it's important to have intact forest at the coast because they are taking the vapor from the ocean and then like passing it inland. And so you need this kind of unbroken forest to continue like pulling that water along. And anyway, I interviewed her for a story and she was saying like, we're not surprised when birds need build nests. Like every organism has evolved ways to get the things that they need. So, it shouldn't be too surprising that forests are collectively pulling in the water that they need.
Oh, and actually the wind too, because a lot of those plants are wind pollinated.
Yeah, I mean, what she's saying is like they're creating the wind.
Yeah,
Yeah,
pulling the water and that's creating the wind and that's helping them
yeah.
affect. Wow, that's so neat.
Yep, plants are pretty cool.
I, I learn new things every day. Um, so Jean Voyage does amazing restoration work. And she's asking about saving water in underground basins. I'm really interested in sort of the aquifers, and you were talking about a difference between the water on land and the aquifers, and that there's a transition zone.
Yeah, let me share again all the things that oh shoot. Oh yeah, no, I do have it here. So this was a project that I talk about in my book. And this is what urban streams, like if they're not buried, if they're at the surface, this is often what they look like. They're straightened, they have, that causes fast water, that causes erosion. And so then they put, concrete or sandbags to stop the erosion. And so this is part of what contributes to flash floods, unstable banks, really heavy pollution from all that runoff, and then waning life, not very much life. And so this researcher in Seattle realized they had a stream that was flooding regularly, flooding a road, a school, people's homes. And she realized that this hyperrheic zone, which means underflow, so there's the surface water and there's the groundwater. And the surface water goes down through the hyporheic into the groundwater and comes up, but it's also moving downstream like the river, but orders of magnitude more slowly because it's moving through all that soil and rock. And this is a very critical place where nitrogen, phosphorus, and carbon cycles happen. It's a critical place for food generation. There are critters who live there who break down pollutants. It's where salmon lay their eggs. And when you have that real, fast water, you've scoured away all that soft material in the stream bed where the hyporheic zone exists. I should also add that a hyporheic zone is not just like under the creek, it extends underneath on the sides of the creek, probably like 30 feet from a creek and up to a mile from a large river. So the river itself is so much bigger than what we see. And that's important to remember. Um, so it's very much like our gut microbiome, like if we don't have good biodiversity there, we're not healthy. And when the hyporheic zone is scoured away and they don't have all these critters who live there, the stream has very little hope of staying healthy. And so this biologist who worked for the city, that's her in the front, her name is Catherine Lynch. She was like, let's recreate this missing hyporheic zone. And it was the first in the world attempt to rebuild and repopulate a missing hyporheic zone. So, over 20 years, they bought out willing sellers, people whose homes kept flooding. They put back the curves. They added 8 feet of gravel and sediment to the bottom. They did a lot of modeling to try to figure out where to put the wood to kind of encourage the water to go down into the hyporheic zone. And the historical ecology was really important. This river that was flooding was like 15 miles long, and their two projects total together were only 1,600 feet. But using historical ecology, they chose areas that were historic floodplains. And so it shows how like a small space can have a big impact because since they did this project, the area hasn't flooded. And because it was the first in the world, the bean counters didn't want to pay for it. So they got some scientists from the local university to do several studies to try to create a body of science showing what worked, what didn't work. And what they found was that water was moving down into the hyporheic zone 89 times more than before they did the project. Um, it absorbs floods. It provides season water in the dry season. This is a stream that did used to run historically year round. Now it has much more constant water flow, much more constant temperature, which is important for fish. And they tested biology. So ecologists often have this idea of like, if we build it, they will come. But what they discovered was that, when your headwaters are a Home Depot parking lot, these critters aren't coming. And a lot of them are like really small microbes or insects, and they just can't travel across the city to get into a creek. And so, another first in the world, they inoculated the creek with critters from a healthier hyporheic zone. So they put these tubes into a healthier stream, left them there, let the critters crawl aboard, and then like stuck the tubes into the hyporheic zone. And then they measured, like, did they come out there? And they found, not everybody came along and not everybody survived, but the restored areas have 7 times more crustaceans, worms, and insects, and much greater species diversity. Then they did a chemical study. First, they measured all of the pollutants that run off of pavement when you have a storm. They found 1,900 chemicals. And none of this is regulated because it's non-point source pollution, right? It's not coming from a factory. It's just like lawn fertilizer and brake pad dust and like all the chemicals that we use that fall into the pavement and are washed into the creek when the rain comes. And so then they measured, did spending time in the hyporheic zone reduce the pollutants? And they found that spending 3 hours in a 15-foot stretch of the hyporheic zone reduced 78% of the chemicals by at least half. So, the hyporheic zone is such an important part of the stream that so many of us just don't even know about. And so if we are doing a stream restoration project, it's really important to think about that. And particularly in urban areas where the stream has probably been dramatically straightened and constrained, and you've had years of that fast water, there's a good chance that you've scoured away your hyporheic zone. And so like a lot of urban stream restoration, they put in rocks and logs and like they try to make it look habitat-y. They put in some native plants and some curves. But what they were finding is like the biodiversity wasn't really increasing. It was sort of like a crows and cockroaches situation. And they required a lot of ongoing maintenance. They continually like had to be dredged because they weren't, redistributing the sediment in a natural way. Whereas this project, they were dredging this area because, it fills up with fine sediment when all that rainwater rushes the dirt off the pavement. And they were having to dredge like once a year, and it cost $1 million each time. And now they dredge, maybe like once every 5 years. So to a much greater extent, the river is redistributing its own sediment and making its own paths for the water and helping the water to go underground. And just having slow water, which allows the sediment to settle out more.
Wow. Have they talked about expanding that at all?
Oh, they have, yeah. So this project is from, gosh, it's been like 8 years ago now. And so Seattle has done some other streams like that. And for every stream project now, they consider doing it. And it's being done elsewhere in Washington. And they've gotten a ton of interest from around the world. And so, yeah, it's definitely a growing phenomenon.
Amazing.
Well, it's getting late.
And Laura Powers is asking if you can repeat the name of that project again, please.
Oh, yeah, I'm not sure I mentioned it. It's Thornton Creek in Seattle. And I write about it in chapter 3 of my book.
Beautiful.
I also wrote about it in a feature article for Scientific American.
That's wonderful.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I've just been such a long-term fan of, actually, I have right here on my desk. I've been a long-term fan of the Native Plant Society, and it's been such a great resource to me over the years. So yeah, it was a real pleasure to talk with you all.
Thank you so much for being here. Let us know what else you think we can do and can advocate for, because what you're bringing is just so much new information. And every time we can be more specific to the city and to our local green spaces about what we can do, um, every every time we can do a job better, it it makes that next job that much easier.
Yeah, I mean, I think, read my book. Um, there's a lot of information there, and my goal in looking around the world for projects was to find places that, some were dealing with drought, and some were dealing with flooding, and some were dealing with melting glaciers, and some were rural, and some were urban. And what I found is like every single area has unique geology, ecology, and human culture. So every project is going to be unique to its own place. But my goal in the book was to give everybody an example of something somewhat similar to things that were happening in their area. And so they could get ideas from that and figure out how to learn more about the specifics in their own area to be able to make recommendations that would be a good fit there. So that's the goal.
Thank you. All right. Oh, and we've got Bob Hall giving us the Bare Essential Botany of Early Historical San Francisco and the link to that.
Cool. Thank you.
Um,
Yeah, I'll look for that and also the mycorrhizal board game.
oh
Who
my gosh,
knew?
it's fun. It's ridiculously fun.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone who participated tonight. This has been recorded and this will be available on the CNPS YouTube channel. And good night, everyone. Thank you so much, Erica. This has been so much fun.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.